Great, so welcome everybody, croeso to the latest in our series of Caffi Carneddau. So if you haven't been to a Caffi Carneddau talk before, it's part of our series of online talks and webinars that we deliver through the Carneddau Landscape Partnership Scheme. And it's all about raising awareness about the special qualities of Carneddau and what the Carneddau Landscape Partnership is doing to help look after the landscape and how you can get involved as well. And it's all part of the broader aim of the project to help conserve the special heritage of the Carneddau. So if you want to find out more about the partnership and what we do, then you can find us on all the usual social channels. You can sign up to our newsletter. Yeah, so you can find out lots more about what we do. It's not just raising awareness, it's also lots of practical action on the ground and lots of things that you can get involved in. So it's a good way of finding out about other events that we're delivering. So tonight we have John Harold with us. So John is the director of the Snowdonia Society, who are one of the core partners of the Carneddau Landscape Partnership. So they support with lots of the volunteering and community engagement elements of the project. And I can guarantee that it's going to be a really great talk from John tonight. He delivered a similar talk on the nature of the Carneddau just over a year ago. I think it was in the depths of winter, if I remember, and in the depths of lockdown. So yeah, and if you've been to any of John's talks before, then you'll know they never fail to disappoint. Lots of food for thought and lots of interesting things to learn about. So yeah, so enjoy. So that's enough from me, and I'll hand over to John. Thanks, John.
Right, diolch Marian. Diolch I bawb am ymuno â ni heno 'ma. Thanks to you all for coming to join us for this talk this evening. I'll just start with the sort of the classic disclaimer, which is trying to talk about or describe or bring to life the nature of the Carneddau in less than an hour is a task that's beyond me, and I dare say beyond most people. So I make no apologies for the fact that what you're about to see is a selection, if you like, almost a random selection of interesting snippets and highlights. We could fill this talk many times over with the different species, different habitats in and around the Carneddau, but this is just a snapshot, hopefully to whet your appetites and to really to hopefully to encourage you to look at the Carneddau from a nature perspective and to hopefully to learn more, keep your eyes open and enjoy that aspect of this wonderful area. So thanks to Marian for the introduction. I am John Harold. I am the director of the Snowdonia Society, and we are Snowdonia's conservation charity. So we're very pleased to be able to help all kinds of organisations and projects, very much including the Carneddau project, with our teams of volunteers who are out several times every week helping with the wide range of tasks in looking after parts of the national parks. In the Carneddau in particular, we're working on things like Himalayan balsam and the management of archaeological sites, scrub control, and also helping with the management of some of the chough feeding areas. So those are some of the areas that we're helping with specifically as part of the project, but our work is wide across the national park. So given that it's the evening and probably many of us have had a long and busy day, I'm going to make life easy for you. We're going to start at the top of the mountains and walk down rather than slogging our way up. So we're going to start where most people's mental image of the Carneddau probably starts, with the high summit plateaus. And this is where we have one of the most extraordinary, special, scarce and fragile habitats in the whole of Wales, which is the summit habitats, the montane heath or tundra habitats of the high tops of the Carneddau. And if we think about the Carneddau in terms of northern Snowdonia, well, in terms of Wales, obviously the Carneddau has the highest, the most extensive area of high ground in Wales. So that image on the right is simply, you know, a heat map of altitude, as it were, and you can see that the Carneddau includes more of the high ground of Snowdonia than the other mountain areas put together. And if you look at the image on the left, that's an average wind speed map, and the very dark blue on the Carneddau really matches the same sort of colour that you see up on the Cairngorms in Scotland, and also in the Outer Hebrides and the Northern Isles of Scotland. So in terms of climate, in terms of altitude, exposure, climate, wind, etc., the Carneddau stand out in Wales as perhaps the most extreme environmental conditions that you could experience, and that's why the Carneddau is where the bulk of the tundra habitats of Wales are found. So the tundra or montane heath is an ancient habitat. It's a habitat that really was first formed as the glaciers retreated after the last ice age. It's dominated by rock, it's dominated by dwarf shrubs, lichens, mosses, and it's a habitat that has probably been relatively constant and continuous in a recognizable form for longer than any other habitat in Snowdonia, perhaps more widely than that. So thousands of years of these extreme climatic conditions have kept this habitat in a broadly consistent form for a very long time. So I've called it tundra habitat, this habitat of the high summits, and the word tundra comes from a Sami, the people of Lapland, the Sami word, which describes a treeless area, usually a high area above the natural tree line. And this habitat, what I think is wonderful about this habitat is that it links us here in the Carneddau in northern Snowdonia directly to other parts of the world. It links us to the high Arctic, as seen here in northern Norway, well north of the Arctic Circle. Very similar habitats there on the relatively lower altitudes to what we see on the top of the Carneddau. And I think those links are really, really interesting. It makes us think about what we have here and where we are in the world. So what is this habitat? As I've said, it's dwarf shrubs, mosses, lichens. By dwarf shrubs, I mean things like heather, bilberry, crowberry, cowberry, a range of mosses and lichens, and it's this habitat that's shaped by extreme cold or exposure. So it's a habitat that's made up of species that can withstand those conditions above the natural tree line. We can't often see where the natural tree line is here in Snowdonia, but it is there. There is a point above which trees simply can't grow. It's hard to see it on the ground, but it does exist. And of course, I said it links us to other areas, and if we were to go back enough thousands of years, we might well have creatures like this on the Carneddau. It certainly reindeer were widespread across the British Isles following the last glaciation. I think the last thought to have finally died out, but perhaps between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, probably longer ago in the Carneddau. Those are sort of from Scotland, but so we don't have this species, but of course we do have large herbivores in the Carneddau in the shape of the Carneddau ponies, which of course, as large herbivores, probably fill at least a vaguely similar niche. And we'll look at some more species of this high summit tundra habitat, and this is perhaps the most evocative of the lot. This is the Dotterel, a bird that has bred on the Carneddau on a very few occasions, and as such is part of our our sort of wider fauna. And the Carneddau is probably the only area in Wales where it's feasible for this species to nest. It is an Arctic species largely, and I say the records of breeding here are very, very thin on the ground, but it is part of that breeding suite of species, and a fabulous creature. The beautiful thing about this is that it's perfectly possible to see this species in its habitat, as it were, on the Carneddau pretty much every year, simply by going up onto the summits, the plateaus, the stony ridges in May when they pass through on their way north. Harder to spot in autumn, but they do come back through in the autumn when they finish breeding in the far north. And a fabulously interesting species, complex, sort of unusual social behavioral patterns. So it's one of those rare species where it's the females that are brightly coloured. The females leave the males to raise the chicks, and often will sometimes move on hundreds of miles to lay another batch of eggs with another mate, and then leave that mate to raise the chicks. So definitely a species that's forward looking in its social behaviour. I'll say no more about that in case I get myself into trouble. But it's a fantastic creature to experience in the Carneddau, and I've been lucky enough to do this many times. When I first did, I listened to the bird watchers who told me that you had to go to the summit of Foel in the first week of May to see it, because that's where they go. It turns out that's simply where the bird watchers know they can see it. If you go up onto the high ground of the Carneddau or the Llugaeron, around late April, early May, and you get lucky, you can see them pretty much anywhere on stony tundra type ground habitats. So this gives you an idea of where we are in the life cycle of this species, and we are almost uniquely placed. The orange is where the Dotterel nests. The blue is where it spends the winter. So you can see that, passing through from winter to summer quarters, we're on that flight path. But the fact that it has bred here, I think, is a lovely indication of where we sit, right on the edge. Right on the edge. Think of the summit of the Carneddau in particular as the farthest flung outpost of this species, as the farthest flung outpost in many ways of tundra type habitats. Move on to another species with very similar global distribution to the Dotterel, and this is a little moth called Catoptriophercatellus. It's one that's special to me for reasons which will become obvious in a moment, but it's simply another example of a species that's uniquely adapted to extreme exposure these tundra habitats, and is only found on the very high ground in Snowdonia, including the Carneddau. So there are not many records of this species. I'm going to show you all the records of this species in Wales, and as you can see, that they're quite thinly scattered. After 1930, the next record was 2013 by a certain John Harold, and I can tell you that it was a very, very exciting day when I came across this species. Wasn't actually on the Carneddau, but as you'll see, subsequent to this, it has been seen on the Carneddau. And what's interesting here is, if you think about this, with these very few records of a species like this, a true Arctic species, isolated on the summits of the highest mountains, after 1930, it would have been very easy to conclude that, you know, changing climate, having not been seen for what, 80 years, it'd be very easy to conclude, well, it's probably not here anymore. You know, and to attribute that to climate change. And of course, we now know that that's not the case, and we have to be quite careful. You know, there's a lot of very reasonable and sensible talk about the high summits and the risk of species that are specialists there being lost. And clearly that's true. It's a high risk, you know, in a climate change scenario world that we're in. But we must remember something else, that to live in those kinds of places, species do have to be extremely tough. And although the climate on the summit of the Carneddau is certainly changing, you know, the persistence of snow has decreased massively in recent decades. We know that for a fact, for example. But if you were to ask a different question, ask overall, have the climatic conditions there become any more favourable? That's a more difficult question to answer, because we might be substituting, for instance, you know, winter cold, average winter cold or average snow lie on one hand, changing, with perhaps increased wind speeds, you know, increased exposure on the other, or increased rainfall, or, you know, some other changes that have that same effect of restricting what other species can thrive there and compete with these species that are there already. It's a complex question, and I don't think we should jump to too many conclusions. So this is the total distribution of this little moth in Wales, which again gives you an idea of you know, how special these high mountain habitats are. And this is the distribution of this species, this little moth, the world distribution, the global distribution. And again, you can see how here on the Carneddau and on the other highest mountains of northern Snowdonia, we are right on the edge. We are this outlier of tundra habitat, and it makes it something very special, something very precious, and something that we must strive to look after. And I'll just focus in on one particular plant of this habitat, and this is the wonderful little dwarf willow. So a tiny tree, a minuscule tree, a kind of willow that grows no more than a couple of inches tall, lives for centuries, very, very long-lived individual trees, but never gets higher than a couple of inches tall. Carpets the ground. That's Salix herbaceae. And it is a fascinating feature of these isolated summit plateaus, particularly on Iseldir and on the Carneddau, where there are some reasonably extensive stands of this miniature mountain tree. And here it is, proving that it is a willow with those fluffy seed heads forming. And the other wonderful thing about this is that it's a tree in more than name. It's a tree in the sense of its ecological behaviour, because like the trees in any lowland woodland, this little tiny willow forms complex associations with fungi. It's difficult to see on these pictures, but these fungi, the fly agaric there on the left, the seps on the right, they are growing in mycorrhizal association, this special symbiotic relationship with the dwarf willow. The dwarf willow is carpeting the ground around them. The fungi and the tree are living together. Really, the tree probably can't, the dwarf willow probably can't survive without the fungi, and the fungi probably in this case can't survive without the dwarf willow, because there aren't any other tree species around. So in some of these amazing summit habitats, you get this combination of a tiny dwarf willow carpeting the ground, and then suites of fungi at the appropriate time of year, usually sort of August time. In this case, these are relatively common fungi, but in the same areas, we will also get exceptionally rare Arctic alpine fungi like Amanita nivalis, the snow amanita on the left there, and a thing called Russula pascua, one of the brittle gills on the right there. So these are true Arctic or Arctic alpine fungi species. So you put this together, and what you have is a really remarkable phenomenon. What you're dealing with is effectively a woodland on the highest summits of the mountains, but a woodland where the trees are dwarfed by the fungi that they live in association with. So it really is a quite remarkable thing to see, with the fungi towering above the trees that they're attached to, in effect. And this, this hasn't happened overnight. This is a truly an indicator of an ancient habitat that thrives under extreme conditions. These areas of this tundra habitat, particularly with the dwarf willow, are very isolated. They're little islands on the summits, and it's taken probably several millennia for these ecosystems to develop with their full fungal assemblages. Very, very special indeed. Right, I think we're going to move off the summits now, and we're going to go down to the cliffs and crags and some of the rocky areas, particularly the steep exposures where the classic, if you like, rock stars of Snowdonia have their homes, and clearly we're talking about things like the Snowdon lily, which obviously does occur on the Llugaeron and on the Carneddau, as well as on the Snowdon Massif itself, and then some of the other key Arctic alpine species like the moss campion on the left, the mountain avens in the centre, and the purple saxifrage on the right there. So a whole suite of these species found on cliffs and crags where the geology is right for them. Places like Cranberry, of course, and here is the wonderful mountain avens, Dryas octopetala, growing somewhere in the vicinity of Cranberry and being pollinated by another hill or mountain species, the bilberry bumblebee. A lovely thing to come across, and a lovely combination here, really evocative, and something that in Wales you can only see on the Carneddau. There are no other. The the mountain avens is found in the Carneddau and nowhere else in Wales. And it's worth mentioning there is a suite of these Arctic alpine plant species which are a focal point for a botanical interest, of conservation interest, the various sort of rare saxifrages, the mountain avens here, and one or two other plants that are a focus for a project that will be starting fairly soon now, called Natur am Byth. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. And here in Snowdonia, here in Eryri, the mountain avens is one of the target species for that project, as is the holly fern. Here's the holly fern, another rare mountain species, another Natur am Byth target species. So what I like here is the links between projects. The Carneddau project is taking a big picture approach, is doing some quite large scale works across the Carneddau. A project like Natur am Byth will come along and will focus right in on individual species and direct works to conserve those particular species, and we're certainly looking forward to helping with that in the same way that we're helping with the Carneddau project. This photograph is interesting because this is the holly fern, technically in the Carneddau. Now, the last record of the holly fern in the Carneddau in the wild was, I think, in the 1990s. I believe it's quite likely that it is still present in the Carneddau, but somebody needs to go out there and find it, if anyone fancies a challenge. But this actual plant is in someone's garden. It is in the Carneddau, but it's in someone's garden, and they are looking after it very well. I'll say no more about that. So we'll move on, and we will move on to another really important habitat in the Carneddau and in Snowdonia as a whole, and in Britain as a whole, because collectively we have a huge international responsibility for the conservation of heathland, like this lovely section here in the sort of northeast corner of the Carneddau, and heathland habitats, again, quite ancient, often likely to be in the region of thousands of years old, because much heathland traces its roots back to the first farming, the first clearance of land and management of grazing livestock across the landscape. Heathland in our climate is one of the sort of the habitats that is produced by relatively low intensity combinations of grazing and burning management, and the extensive areas of heathland that we have here support some very special species, and we'll meet one or two of those in a moment. But obviously heathland is another habitat that includes these dwarf shrubs, so heather, bell heather, western gorse, some of the other smaller species like the cross-leaved heath in wetter areas. So these dwarf shrubs are the dominant element of this habitat. And it's a habitat that is it's part of the landscape. It brings colour to the hills, and it has entirely its own sort of character and feel and atmosphere. In that, if you like, in the sort of middle ground, well below the summits, very roughly speaking, between 350 and perhaps 600 to 700 meters in altitude. A broad zone, but a very important one. So when we look at at the heathland we might have bell heather and common heather or ling, species like hard fern. These are on where the heathland is on acidic ground, which is the vast majority of our heathland habitats in this area. Species such as the cowberry, an attractive and important part of many heathland habitats. You'll also be familiar with perhaps with the crowberry, which has narrower leaves, very, very tough, a really hardy plant. And then in these habitats, at the right time of year, we come across some charismatic species, and here's one that fills me with joy when I do come across it. This is the emperor moth. Actually, really quite a common species, particularly in heathland, in heathy and slightly scrubby areas. This is not a scarce species at all. It happens to be one of the largest and most impressive moths we have in the British Isles, and a wonderful creature to come across. But the slight fly in the ointment here is that you have to be quite lucky to find one that's freshly emerged, to see it, to get a view and to get pictures like this, because once they're up and about, they don't hang around. So the usual sighting of an emperor moth is of something flying across the heathland very, very fast indeed, too fast to even identify it, and that's in April, perhaps into May, on warmish days. And what you're usually seeing is the males flying around in search of following the pheromone trails that the females emit to attract the males, and we know that the males can track down the females over really quite long distances, probably measured in kilometres, and the females tend to be much more sedentary, to stay hidden low down in the vegetation and simply wait for the pheromones to do their work and attract the males to them. But a stunning creature, and well worth looking out for. So, in the next, certainly in April, that's a sort of peak flight period for this species. And then moving on to another moth, and I make no apologies, these are random selections. I happen to have spent perhaps slightly too much of my life studying moths, and that's why I've brought these species in. They're simply examples of the richness of what's out there. This is the remarkable weaver's wave moth, tiny, beautifully camouflaged on the quartz outcrops that are so common across the mountains of northern Snowdonia, exceptionally rare, and the form that we have in northern Snowdonia and in the Carneddau is unique to is an endemic form, so found nowhere else in the world. So this subspecies, that little map there, the red dots clustered in northwest Wales and including the Carneddau, it effectively is the global distribution of this moth. So can be found if you're exceptionally sharp-eyed and determined by searching these quartz rocks. I have seen it done. I have done it once myself. More easily found by using moth lights, nocturnal, setting out lights at night to see the species. And if you'd like to see this exceptionally special North Wales Snowdonia speciality, I make a very simple recommendation. Go to Pensachnant Conservation Centre I think it's in July. Every year Julian puts out lights, and in most years he catches some of these moths, and you get a chance to see them. They're then released again back into the wild, and it's an amazing thing to see. It's something really remarkably special to our area, and a unique opportunity to see something that otherwise you would go your whole life through without experiencing. So get in touch with Julian at Pensachnant and get involved. So we'll move on to some wet habitats now. We're going to move off the drier heathland into the watery domain and the bogs and wetlands where the wonderful cotton grass weaves its magic in the spring. There's nothing quite like a bog full of cotton grass to stir the soul. Of course, the water doesn't stay on the tops. It has to make its way downhill, and it finds every way of doing that. Here we are going down the Afon Lloer, following the water as it moves, as it fills and shapes the landscape in its many different ways, whether that's held in the bogs, whether it's running off in these fast streams, or moving more slowly where the gradient changes. Water shapes so much of the habitats of the Carneddau. The landform itself, the whole landscape, of course, shaped by water, but then it also shapes the habitats within that landscape, and we see that in different places, in quiet little corners like this, in very familiar spots like the Aber Valley, or little special places like Cwmcaseg, places where and in all these places where the water gathers or stays sufficiently to create these conditions of high humidity. This is where we see one of the real riches of Snowdonia, where the humidity is high enough, and we see the mosses and liverworts really developing in their diversity, taking advantage of those conditions and doing what they've been doing for eons, for time immemorial, eking out their existence in places where nothing else can live, and doing so in immense diversity, overlooked diversity. The real, if we're looking for the rainforests of Snowdonia, the rainforests of the Carneddau, it is the assemblages of mosses and liverworts in these damp habitats, whether it's in gorges or in places like this along the sheltered north-facing stream sides. And I'll just flick you through some of this, a tiny fragment of this diversity of liverworts and mosses, just to give you an idea. I could throw some names at you. I'm not sure whether they add poetry to the pictures or not, but this is Plagiochila punctata, for example, and Rhytiadelphus laureus, and the names are as varied as the plants, all tiny, all easily overlooked, little microcosms of life, and each living out its life in a very specific, each requiring a very specific set of conditions. And in some places in Snowdonia, we have sites where within tiny areas there can be hundreds of species, and this is real biodiversity. This is biodiversity on the kind of level that we talk about when we talk about the rainforest. But you don't have to be a sort of, you don't have to be focused in on biodiversity to recognize the importance of this, because amongst these species there are some that are of importance in a different way, of importance for our whole how we manage our whole way of life now. And these are the bog mosses, the sphagnum mosses. These are doing a job of the peat bogs, the peat forming species of mosses are doing a job on a scale that no other habitat can do in terms of storing carbon, long term, locking it away long term, managing water, managing the flow of water off the land, and the effects downstream on us all, of that work that the peat bogs are doing for us. So economically important in sort of how we respond to climate. Healthy functioning peat bogs are a key tool in our modern sort of looking ahead at how we approach some of the big challenges of our times. So from microscopic beauty to really fundamentally important, it's all spanned within this overlooked group of plants. And the habitats that these peat bogs easily overlooked, they look a bit brown. They, until you actually get in amongst them, they don't particularly excite the eye. But when you do get in there, you see beauty wherever you look, and interest wherever you look. So a classic plant of the peat bogs here, the cranberry, beautiful little thing that can only thrive in really good quality, healthy, thriving bog habitats. And so that role of the sphagnum mosses, the peat bogs in water storage, carbon storage, and the management of both, really important. So we have to look after these peat bogs, and I'm very glad that we've got some good peatland repair and restoration works as part of the Carneddau project, alongside other peatland projects throughout Wales. And I think it's fair to say that in Wales we have a proactive approach to peatland restoration. Needs to go further, but it's a good start has been made on that. Something to be proud of, I think. And just a key note on that: when it comes to all these peatland habitats, we do need to watch out for some of the less obvious threats and the encroachment of these plantation conifer species onto our peatlands and wetlands and other habitats of conservation importance is something that really does need to be sort of responded to. And I'm very glad to say that the Snowdonian Society has been very active in this, in supporting our partners, getting volunteers out to clear the spreading conifer problems from a number of sites across Snowdonia. Just moving on and moving sort of down the hill a bit further now, perhaps mostly out of the peatland zone, but staying in the wet habitats and into the sort of lower lying, often marshy areas, other types of wetlands, which often can have, when in good condition, can have really huge botanical diversity, beautiful species that thrive there, and need to be looked after again from different issues there in terms of nutrient enrichment, a key issue that needs to be managed to protect these more lowland wetlands and the species in them, like the wonderful bog bean, for example. And we'll move a bit further on now. We'll really move down into the sort of the lower reaches of the Carneddau, into the woodlands. And any good botanist will tell you that when you go into a woodland, what you do, you don't look up, you look down. You look down to see what's on the ground, look at the ground flora, and that's where you will be able to tell the story of that woodland and understand more about it. And that's certainly a good thing to do in the spring, as the woodland ground flora unfurls and bursts into life and into flower. And again, not to overlook the less obvious elements of that. Woodlands effectively are driven by the activities and the interrelationships of the trees with the fungi. Fungi effectively are what make woodlands work. So important to spend some time looking at what's happening in that part of the woodland floor. And I think finally I'm going to take us to one more. There's a bit of a theme here. It's about the things that are easily overlooked, I suppose. It's about I suppose trying to see the wood for the trees, as they say, and this final habitat is perhaps one of the most overlooked of the lot, and this is the unimproved pasture land. And around the Carneddau, some fantastic examples of this, particularly on the northern flanks above Bethesda and around the sort of to the east from there. And I'm talking about again, often quite ancient habitats. This is where low intensity farming has shaped grasslands without the addition of artificial fertilizer and without recent ploughing and reseeding. These habitats may not look terribly exciting from a distance. They're not even necessarily botanically very diverse. But in some cases, in certain sites where the combination of the history of this low intensity farming, traditional farming, and climate and soils comes together, we see the most extraordinary sort of proliferation of life in the most unexpected form. And that's in the form of the grassland fungi. And we have in northern Snowdonia, we have some of the most important sites for grassland fungi in the world. So another example of something that is very special here, where we have a responsibility alongside the tundra on the summit, alongside the heathlands, alongside those high humidity habitats of the mosses and lichens, these grassland fungi sites, very easily overlooked, very easily destroyed, but wonderful examples of biodiversity where the most extraordinary life forms for a brief period of the year show themselves, are there to be admired, enjoyed, recorded, and appreciated, and something really special. So I hope that in this journey, whether it's around some of the habitats from the high summits to the lowlands, and amongst this admittedly random selection of species, from the large to the small, from the very obvious to the to the more obscure, that I have whetted your appetite. I have given you a glimpse into just a very few of the species that you can, and I hope that you will enjoy in the Carneddau, and hopefully some of that as part of the work of this wonderful Carneddau project. So with that, I will say diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I will say thank you to the good people who allowed me to use images that weren't my own images, and I will say thank you very much to you all for listening.
Thank you so much for that, John. It was wonderful talk, just absolutely packed with lots of interesting stuff as always, and really amazing pictures as well. It's really, really inspiring, and it's made me want to go right out there. It's supposed to be sunny this weekend, isn't it? Just to see some of those wonders that the Carneddau's got to offer. Yeah, really fantastic.
Yeah,
great time of year as well.
Well, absolutely. I was just going to say you've hit the nail. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there. We're right on the point where the year is turning. In the lowlands, in the woodlands around the edges of the Carneddau, spring is that I talked about the woodland floor. It's bursting into life right now. The first the spring flowers are in the hedgerows, just starting. It's time to get out and enjoy them. We're also right at that on the cusp of the the bird migration season. The birds arriving from Africa. Any day. I haven't yet seen my first wheat ear this year, but I expect to any day now. And on the slopes of the hills, wherever it's rocky and and good weather in the next few days, there will be wheat ears, and they will be fresh from Africa. They will have made that journey. They'll be here for the summer. They'll be nesting on the Carneddau. Yeah, something to enjoy.
So I think we've got about 5 minutes for some questions. If anybody has any questions, then please feel free to pop them in the chat. Got lots of people saying thank you. Bendigedig. That was a great downhill journey. It was. It's lovely how you sort of take us down the mountain. It's yeah, a real journey. I mean, well, I guess I have a question. I guess you touched a bit on in your talk about some of the challenges that are facing the nature of the Carneddau. What would you say is the sort of biggest single threat to nature and wildlife in the Carneddau, and do you see any sort of opportunities for sort of addressing them?
Yeah, I think the second part of that is almost easier to answer than the first part. I think one of the things that I would really like to see happen, either as part of the Carneddau project or as part of the legacy of the Carneddau project, is the conversation about, and this is a big conversation for all of us, whether we're involved as local people who enjoy the place, who live here, or involved in the management of the place, is about the vision. What is the vision for the Carneddau? We have this landscape, as we know from the project, landscape full of stories of the prehistory and history of the area, landscape shaped by centuries, if not millennia of farming, and used by all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. And I think we've reached a point where the conversations between different people with different interests and different sort of viewpoints needs to move us forward to a point where we can start talking about a vision for what the Carneddau, what we want, moving from what we've got now and appreciating what we've got now to what we want. And I think that's in a sense, I could almost turn the question around and say that in a sense that's the biggest challenge as well, because we have the capacity, we have the capacity to look after and direct this. If we want the land management to deliver what we want, if we want the other management to protect features and the archaeology and all these things, we can do that. What we need is the vision, so that we can then say to the farmers and land managers, this is how we want to look after this area. This is how we're going to help you deliver that. These kind of conversations that match the resources to look after the place with a sort of coherent view of what we want people in the future to see when they're in the Carneddau.
And I guess it's something that's so easy to sort of lose sight of, isn't it? Sort of just kind of constantly ploughing ahead and doing lots of work to sort of restore habitats and that sort of thing, but sometimes you sort of forget to take a step back and really look at the long view. What where are we actually going? Yeah. So we had a question about so Rick is hopefully moving to the Cravnat Valley next week. They'll be doing their bit to tackle Himalayan balsam. Is there anyone in particular to reach out to on that invasive in particular?
Yeah, Well, that's an easy one to answer, because the thing to do is get in touch with the Snowdonia Society straight away, because what we are doing as part of this project is helping individuals and local communities in particular to tackle this species on their doorstep. That's the best way to tackle these kind of problems, and we're providing support, input, hard graft, and so get in touch with us, drop us an email, and we'll pick up that conversation. We actively we actively want to help people to help with this issue, and we're here to do that. So yeah, great, excellent, can't wait.
Fabulous. Couple of people saying thanks, and they'll be keeping their eyes close to the ground on their walks. I remember you saying that, I think, in your last talk, about how you really got to sort of keep your eye out. It's the little things that make the Carneddau special, isn't it? You've got the ponies, which are obviously lovely,
Yeah.
but there's lots more to it than that. So somebody asking, your unimproved grassland photo showed bracken in the background. With climate change, is this a problem in the Carneddau?
I would say probably yes, because the thing with bracken is that it is part of, it has a role to play, looked at from a nature conservation perspective, it has a role to play in the landscape. But with climate change, what we can often see in many places is the upper altitudinal limit of bracken is determined by winter cold. So if the winters are becoming milder and bracken is able to move a little bit further uphill, in a lot of places, all of a sudden that can make quite a big difference, because if you think about the sort of topography of the hills, very often a few meters further uphill suddenly means that it can bridge across into another valley, or across a shoulder of land that previously was a barrier to it. So superficially you might think, well, it's only going to go uphill by a meter a year or whatever it is, but it's actually, it can become exponential if it means that the bracken can suddenly spread into areas where it wasn't before. So certainly those grassland fungi habitats, bracken management, and I mean physical management rather than chemical management, absolutely essential, because the two don't go together. So yeah, again, good example of how we need to support farmers and landowners to target management to protect precious habitats.
Great. Well, we've just passed 8 o'clock, so I think we'll have to wrap up there. So yeah, just to say once again, thank you very much, John, for a fascinating and informative talk, as always. And just to say again, yeah, thank you to everybody as well for tuning in. And if you've enjoyed the talk tonight, then as I said before, you can sign up to our newsletter and find out about other talks that we'll be doing on other topics, all ranging from archaeology and Neolithic axes to things like the nature of the Carneddau and all sorts of things, place names, stories, you name it. The Carneddau's got a lot to celebrate. And of course you can get in touch with the Snowdonia Society as well if you're interested in getting involved in Himalayan balsam or any other sort of volunteering and practical action on the ground to help look after the Carneddau and beyond in Snowdonia. So thank you very much, everybody. Diolch yn fawr, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Diolch pawb, nos da.